In this video I'm going to continue modeling the Samaritan pistol. I'm going to move on to the cylinder here. And on this piece we need to consider, as you can see, there's quite a lot of detail here. So we need to consider what's going to be textured versus what's going to need to be geometry. And so as I just sort of alluded to, this piece here would work very well as a bump map or normal map because it doesn't change in profile. If you see this thing from the front, you wouldn't be able to tell because it's all just pushed down. It's inside a form that sort of obscures the fact that it's not actually there if it's done with a texture. Whereas this piece here, this actually is visible. So you can see in profile, this actually changes this form. It has these little divots here. So we need to actually add this as geometric detail. These side pieces, these cut ends here, those will need to be actually added. I'll go over here. So here you can see how those look with the bullets in. And here's what it looks like from the back when that flips open. So we'll need to do all this with geometric detail. The rest of this business in here is probably something that could be handled with texture, partly because this is going to get pretty expensive to create this piece, and if we needed to add all of this extra business as geometric detail, it would get way too expensive. We're trying to keep this thing sort of as a medium low res mesh. So texturing this stuff is going to work fine. We're not going to see this for a long time in a game view anyways. It'll just flip open, be reloaded, and close back. So there's no sense in spending a big bunch of our geometry budget on that. So we'll go ahead and start by adding a cylinder. So just need to make sure it's oriented down Z. 24 axis division sounds like about appropriate. So I'll go ahead and move this up. And I'm going to just size this thing a little larger than it appears to be because, again, we are seeing this with perspective distortion in the reference image. So we're seeing it sort of from the bottom, which means we might not see the true top here because we're sort of, the angle is obscuring that a little bit. So something like that looks pretty close. Might just be a tiny bit too big. So I want to make sure that down here we have a little clearance. Here's my other piece of geometry, so there's no interpenetration. Looks good. Went a little over the top, which is where it should be. And then in the back, we got a little bit of a problem, a little too deep. So I'm just scale that down and move that up here. So I do want to leave this bit of a gap here so that I can add that other piece coming in. And that might be a little excessive. But I can come back. In fact, it looks like it almost certainly is just a tiny bit too. So I'm just going to scale that up just a bit. So maybe something like that. And I'm not sure that if we ended up right back where we were. Okay, so that actually looks a little better there. So I'll just sort of push that back. So just leave a little bit of a notch. Doesn't look like it's a huge bit there. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So I'll double check this from our perspective view. Just make sure the resolution looks appropriate. So it's looking pretty good. It's not too round. It's not too high resolution. It actually looks pretty spot on. So let me take a look at this thing from the front. Just to talk about this one thing, even though I'm not going to need to make a change to this, this is something you need to consider. Besides just your relative resolution, take a look at how you're going to actually construct this thing. So for instance, if I cut this thing in half vertically, then I only have to model half. But this, in this case, it's basically can be cut horizontally as well. So all I need to do is model this 1/4 and then just mirror it down and then mirror it over, and I'll have the whole piece. So that's definitely the most efficient way to model this, and just something to think about. I need to have a vertical cut here and a horizontal cut here, which means that the resolution of this piece needs to be evenly divisible by 4 on that axis. So if this was 22, for instance, notice that this sort of gets no center line. So this would be really difficult to deal with this. I mean, you could cut it and everything, but it's just much easier just to already have that cut in there. So something like that would work very well. I'll just grab those faces, all the faces that I don't want, and delete those out. And then double check this. Okay, everything's looking good. So now I want to add in this detail here. So I want to just cut this face out. But I don't want to just cut this one face right here, because that will leave sort of something that has to be triangulated. So then it has to triangulate down like this, and that'll end up shading this thing a little funny. So what you typically want to do is cut all the way across the curvature. And this is a little different than modeling. When you're modeling flat, you can have n-gons all over the place. when you're modeling on curves, you really can't, because when it triangulates, it's going to end up giving you really weird shading artifacts. So in this case, I want to pull out to the Cut Faces tool, interactive mode, and then hold shift and drag down. That'll just give me a perfectly vertical cut. And I'll grab those faces. And I do need to do the top as well, because since this is being quartered, when it mirrors down, I need that hole to be on the next piece, and same on the top. So that will work just like that. And then I'll go back to the side here. We'll start adding this piece here in. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a sphere. That sphere just needs to be oriented down Z, which it is in this case. And then just try to get it basically lined up here. And we'll start taking a look at resolution on this guy, because obviously we're way too high. And I'm going to actually do something that allows me to get this thing set up a little bit more appropriate. But for right now, something like this is fine. We'll just get a sense of what we're looking at resolution-wise. So I'm going to go ahead and snap this so that it lines up. So I'm just going to hold V and snap back to that point, and V on this one and snap it. So basically what I did is I just snapped it where this line right here cuts right through the middle of the sphere. And that'll allow me to go ahead and figure out what I'm looking at resolution-wise. So if I pull down here to my subdivisions on axis, what I want to do is just pull that down to some place that looks kind of appropriate. So 9 doesn't make sense because the way the spans are cutting across. That looks like, you know what, it's going to be kind of difficult to tell exactly what we have until we get these things scaled appropriately, but that looks pretty reasonable in terms of overall number of spans. And then as far as height goes, what you need to consider here is, as I drive this thing down, see if I were to go down to 6 here, if I were to pull these spans back, see that angle that goes from the center line to the next line? That would be in our actual mesh. So what I want to do is I want to pick a resolution that has no center line, and that way I can just grab all the verts on this end and pull them out, and it'll sort of everything will match, so it'll be a nice flat line across that way. I'm going to take a look at this thing from the front just to get a sense of where we are. So in terms of depth and size of this, it's going to be much easier to deal with this if we can just sort of scale this business down to match what's going on here with our perspective distortion. An easy way to do that, instead of grabbing each individual object, is just go ahead and group them. So I'll just group those guys, and then I'm going to move the pivot point for that group to the center. Then I can go ahead and scale that down, and it looks like it needs to be rotated so I can actually get a sense, and it looks like that's going to be about 45, or exactly 45. And then this whole piece looks like it's not quite at the center, so maybe something like that is closer to center. Then I'll go ahead and scale that down so where the cylinder looks like it's pretty close to the correct. So that's pretty close. That's pretty close to where the center point is. I'm just going to leave it up here so that this thing is centered. And then I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments to this guy as well. So the first thing is I might as well go ahead and rotate this so that I have a flat area angling out. So that'll just make it where I have even spans on each side here. So it looks like it's maybe 27.5. Nope, not quite. I'm really having problems with this mouse, so it's just straight 27 it looks like. And then I'll go ahead and just scale this guy down so that it matches what it looks like in that reference image. So something like that looks pretty dang close. Let's take a look at what this looks like in our perspective now. So that would give us 1, 2, 3, 4. That looks pretty good. In fact, I might even be able to push this sphere down a couple, since I don't necessarily need these two spans being really close adjacent like that. So I'm going to go ahead and try to take that down a little bit and see if that helps. Looks like history is giving me a little bit of a problem, so I'll just go ahead and I'm going to leave it here for now. I'm not sure why my history is messing up like that, but I'm going to go ahead and leave it like this, and I'll just clean that up by hand if I need to. I'll just double check this from the side. The scale is obviously way off, so I'll just press up to get back to that group. This is the point of dealing with this group, is now I can just set this back to 0 and this business back to 1, and that should then line up right with where it was. And then the only other thing, I'm going to leave this rotation at 45 on, just because that's definitely helping me right now. So I'll just double check that my alignment works from the front of this piece, which it looks like it's actually pretty close there. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these verts and just move them out. Again, making that a nice straight line so it matches what's going on there. So I'll select that piece, and then the piece that I want to cut it, and just Boolean difference. Everything should be fine in those default options. So that gives me this cut. This is something to be aware of when you're doing Boolean operations. Every single time, almost, maybe not every single time, but nearly every time you do a Boolean, you're going to have to clean it up. So this is the span right here that I felt like maybe we didn't even need this span at all. So I'm going to first just try deleting that. See, that still holds up fine. Definitely don't need that span. That works well. This stuff here, this doesn't really need to be cleaned up, but I could, for instance, select these two and just delete them, and that will give me quads here now. Again, that's not really necessary, but it's something you could do if you just like a little bit cleaner looking topology. And then what I need to be concerned about is, let's see if I can actually find this artifact. It's not that bad in this case. Like these are having to triangulate from this point right here, and it doesn't look that bad in this case, but a lot of times you'll end up with really bad artifacts where it has to triangulate through these n-gons. And the problem is the computer's trying to make this where the lighting is even across this curved surface, and then it has all these extra cuts that it's having to add in based on the fact that this is being triangulated out from this point. So it's driving a triangle here, 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 and here. So that's getting a lot of extra triangles out here. So a lot of times what you'll want to do is just cut this, and I'll just go ahead and do this with the Cut Faces tool. You could do this with Insert Edge Loop or whatever you like. But in this case, I'm going to make a face selection, and it's smart enough to know if you make a face selection, only cut the faces that you have selected. So I'll just go into my, my Cut Faces tool, and I'll just put the cursor really close to that span, and then shift, click and drag down, and that'll just add the cuts where I need them here. Here, so basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create all quads. So this one's actually going to be pretty close to the other span, but I think it'll still be okay. And I do want to go in the direction of the curve, something I haven't really mentioned at this point. Cutting in this direction works really well. You won't actually see any shading artifacts. If I cut this direction, then what happens is it starts to see this as sort of more of a highlight point. So it'll be sort of a flatter area and then more of a highlight point across here. So it'll start creating some weird shading issues for you. And as you can see now, this is showing quite a lot of weird shading artifacts in here. So you see that edge right there. And what that is typically when you do something like the cut faces like I just did, you don't quite get things exactly lined up. So here I have my two verts. I'm just going to merge those. And now I can just go around the mesh pressing G to merge those verts. And if you have a little bit of a gap, like you don't want it to move a certain way, like right here, I didn't really do a fantastic job lining those up. So I'll just come back to that one in a minute. Maybe what I'll do is just grab those two outside ones and snap those, and then grab them all and then press G again, and that should merge those down. And then these are close enough that they'll not present any kind of problem when they have to move to merge. So that looks pretty good. Okay. Alright, so that piece is now looking pretty good. The geometry's basically been cleaned up. Now I just need to do a soften harden on it to see how that looks. Okay, that's looking pretty nice. Okay, so that piece there is looking good. So now we need to add the Boolean through the front. So take a look at this thing from the front view, and basically these have a lot of perspective distortion in them, so they're way smaller than they should be. But the barrel here, this is actually probably pretty close to the size hole that we're actually looking for here. So I'm going to go ahead and set this thing back up to where it was supposed to be. So just press, this thing is no longer part of the group because of the Boolean operation. So I need to go ahead and just recenter this guy. So I'm just going to snap this up. Again, those points are really handy for knowing where the center of the cylinder is. And then I'm just going to rotate this thing -45. And that'll put it right back to where it was. So go ahead and add a cylinder for that there. So this should be already oriented down Z since that was my last setting. So I'll just be careful not to move this off of X because otherwise it won't mirror properly. So I'll just scale this down and match the height, and if it's off a little bit left to right, that's okay. Which it is, but it's not a big deal. So that's the right size. Now I just need to set the right resolution. So again, you want to be aware of your relative resolution. That actually might look fine at 12. Let me just pull out here to take a look. So if we're only ever going to see it from that distance, I think that actually looks pretty good. So we'll go with 12 on this. And one thing I'll need to do is create a duplicate of that. Since I'm just working on a quarter of this, I need the other half of that cutout to be down here. So one easy way would be just to duplicate that, Command D, and then D and V, snap that pivot point down here, and then just rotate that down 90 degrees. That, okay, looks pretty good. And then I'll need to expand these guys back, so I'll go ahead and do that from the side here so that they're actually going through the object. I'm going to Boolean those in. And I'll go ahead and, I'll just talk about this really quickly. You can't do a Boolean on two objects at once. So basically you have to have exactly two objects selected. If you try, it will fail. Have to have two. So one way to do that is just select these two guys and combine them. So now I have one object that I'm going to be using to do the cutting. This is the object I want to cut, this is the object I want to do the cutting, and then mesh, Booleans, and difference. This is very common with Booleans, that Maya just sort of gets rid of everything. It doesn't know how to deal with it, so it just gets rid of them all. And in this case, you can see pretty clearly why. Basically, what Maya has to do when it creates a Boolean is create a volume. And the way this thing cuts in and out and the border edges all over the place, it has no idea what to do with that. So what I would suggest is just grab those end faces, so the flat thing that we're trying to cut, because we don't even care about this, we just want to cut this face, and then just do mesh and extract that. So basically all that does is just make this its own object, which then Maya can cut. And Maya sometimes can Boolean in flat objects like this with no volume, but sometimes this will disappear as well. So we'll just go ahead and try that. Okay, we got the disappearing side of that. So go ahead and select that and extrude it again and pull it way on back. And one thing to double check is make sure you have two-sided lighting off when you're doing this sort of thing, because the normals are backwards, which basically means the Boolean will work backwards from what you expect. So instead of selecting Boolean difference, you would have to choose union in order to make it work like that. But the other way to do this is just make sure your normals all point the right way, and then Booleans will operate as you expect them to. So mesh, Booleans, difference, so everything works out fine there. We don't really care about anything on this thing except for the front face. We just had to add all this volume because Maya wanted us to, basically. So I'll go ahead and combine these two objects back together, just put it back the way it was. Do a merge. Again, you want to make sure that you have a very low tolerance on your merge. I use about 1/1000th, something like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete out some of these extra spans. So all these guys here that are cutting through my mesh and adding extra points that are unnecessary, I'll just go ahead and get rid of those. And then these across here, I'm just going to delete those. So that'll just leave me with a big n-gon on the front, which is easy to look at, and because it's flat, it doesn't matter that it's an n-gon, it'll still triangulate just fine. Then what I want to do is extrude these bits in. So I'll just select them and shift double click. Sometimes you'll get that sort of action. It's okay, just get that away and do that extrusion again. Pull that straight back. Now I'm going to go ahead and snap this to the end like that. And then I want to figure out what I need to do. So I'll take a look at my reference here, and it goes straight in and then it bows out a little bit through there. And then if we see this from another angle, okay, so here, this is a good indication. See that reflection right there? So this just goes straight in on the side, and then it probably follows the contour of the bullet itself, and then connects up to this piece in a 90-degree angle. That's my guess anyways, since I can't see in there. So what I want to do is the same thing I did before, where I make a face selection like this, and I'm going to cut these in this same point right here. So I could have, you know, if I thought ahead, just done this all as one cut, but I already did this one, so we'll just have to do this again as a selective cut. Okay, so just go ahead, I'm going to zoom in nice and tight again, and use cut faces, interactive mode, and then just get your cursor really close to that edge and click and drag. And that's going to be very slightly off, but I'll just snap align it, and it should work out fine. So basically what I want to do is get rid of the faces where they are in my way. So let's see, like that. Looks pretty good. And then maybe these two. And then I'll just do a little bit of append to poly through here and see what we can make happen. So append to poly, those two, and then I'm just going to use Y for append to poly. This one will be a triangle, not a big deal. And then this one to this one. See, I have some edge softening that I'm going to have to take care of, but that should be pretty fast. And this has that bow out, and as you can see, these faces here are just sort of going to end up being in our way, so I'm just going to get rid of those now. And all the other geometry is kind of in my way right now, so I'm just going to press Shift I to put in an isolates perspective, and you can see it right here. You just go to Show, Isolate, Select, View Selected. So that allows me just to see what I'm currently working on, and this side actually looks fine. So I'll just do the same thing that I just did over here, and append to poly. I'm just using Y again. Now I'll double click on these edge loops, and I just want to make sure that I snap align these guys to this edge, or this vert right here. So I'll just go ahead and hold V, snap align there. It's very, very subtle movement, so I probably didn't have to do much to make that happen for me. Okay, now I'll go ahead and do one append to poly here, that, and then for the rest of this, because this is a big n-gon as well, I'm just going to select the whole thing and just do mesh and fill hole. So something like that. It's looking pretty good. Again, make sure you don't have faces where the object needs to be mirrored, so those should remain open. Looks good. I could go ahead and get rid of that. And then let's go ahead and mirror this thing. Looking pretty good here. So it doesn't matter which direction you go first. I need positive X, so I'll just go ahead and do that. Looks like that worked pretty well. And then I'll go negative Y. So I have this one thing that I need to fix here, but otherwise this is looking pretty good. This doesn't really need to be here. It can be. It's not really going to hurt anything if I leave it, but I can also delete that. Should be no problem at all. This still should be able to triangulate just fine. This side back here, same thing as I did before. Just double click, fill that hole, and then delete those edges. Okay, and now let's just do a soften harden on the whole thing. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I'd say that's It's looking pretty nice. So I'm going to Shift I now to get this back, and let me just take a look at what this is looking like. So that looks good for the cylinder. I think that's good enough in terms of geometric detail. All the rest of that would be added in as texture. All right.